Hi, welcome back to Risk Management. Today's talk is entitled Meaningful Causation, Part 2. We'll be picking up where we left off in the last class, talking about where we have known causal relationships, but the magnitude of the cause's effect on the effect is so small that we don't really actually want to worry about such an issue. It's not something that should become the talk of a policy decision maker or something that should be focused on in the media because it skews perceptions. Whenever we talk about something in a causal way, people focus on it. If I start talking about the moon's gravitational effect on people who are falling, there is in fact a causal relationship, but it's of so small a magnitude, it's really not worth discussing in the first place. The same can go for many different topics, and we looked at some in the last class, varying from anthrax spores to gender testing in mathematical exams in middle school. I want to give one more example today to ask and talk about the question, even if we know that there's a proven, statistically significant causal relationship, why should we care about discussing it if it's not a meaningful one? So to motivate this, let's look at a study by Jacobson and Jacobson that was published in the New England Journal of Medicine in 1996. Now, in bringing up the study, it's not to pick on the Jacobsons. They did a very nice job publishing in one of the very top premier journals in the United States. But when we look at their study, besides the fact that there are some biases built into it and some assumptions that make an observational study of this nature somewhat problematic, just as all observational studies are somewhat problematic, the point being was their results, as you will see in a moment, were not meaningful, at least in any major scope. And so one wonders, why was this published in the New England Journal of Medicine in the first place? This study involved Lake Michigan fish, PCBs, and IQ scores. PCBs are an industrial compound that the EPA has rated as a carcinogen, as well as the source of other internal illnesses. In this case, there was a hypothesis that when women who were pregnant ate fish from Lake Michigan, in ingesting that, they gained PCBs into their body. And by taking in PCBs, those PCBs were transmitted to the fetuses, and ultimately children who were born had developmental difficulties that were reflected in lower IQ scores later in life. This hypothesis was borne out to some extent by mechanistic studies that show that PCBs accumulate in fatty sports fish. So the researchers hypothesized that mothers who eat a lot of these fish probably are accumulating high levels of PCB and possibly passing this on to the fetus. So to test this aim, what they did was they said the following causation is our suspected hypothesis. Lake Michigan fish have PCBs. They pass these on to pregnant mothers who accumulate PCBs in their blood, and through a transplacental passing of the PCBs, pass this on to their fetuses when they're pregnant. And that if we track those kids later in life, say at age of 10 or 11, that their IQ scores on standardized tests will be reflected to be lower than their peers as a result of this PCB exposure in utero. Now, when one looks at this study on its face, we shouldn't ever just take for granted that because somebody studied a topic, that in fact proves the causation. As we all know, association doesn't prove causation. Now, in looking at this and looking at the methods that they used, there are a number of potential biases that come up. I'm just going to mention a few here right out of the first paragraph of the methodology taken straight from their study. You can read the whole methodology yourself, but I'll point out in the bracketed parts on the right some obvious biases that have not been eliminated by this study. As is the case in many observational studies, not all bias, chance, or confounders is ruled out if the study design is not a gold standard. So in this case, they examined 212 children, and they gave them IQ tests at age 11. Now, what they had originally done was they had gone and looked at women who were giving birth to children in hospitals around western Michigan near the lakes where fish with PCBs are in the waters. And so in looking at this, they had originally looked at 313 newborn children and taken blood samples from them, although not from all of them, as you will see in a moment. But they had taken blood samples at birth, and then they followed up with the same kids later, and 212 of those 313, 11 years later, were subjected to an IQ test, and their test results were lower than it would have been otherwise for their peers. And so as a result, they concluded in this study that PCB levels affect children's developmental abilities at a later age in life if they're exposed to this through fish that their mother ate. Now, one of the problems with this, of course, is in looking at this, when the children were born, the mothers were given surveys about how much fish did you eat? Well, of course, there's a recall bias that goes on with any of this. Mothers may not remember, particularly right around the time of birth, how many fish they ate in the last 9 or 12 months. And so as a result, there's a recall bias built into the study that mothers may have errantly put down false data about how much fish they were eating. Second, there's also a results bias built into these authors from the start that's clear. They say in the second sentence here, each species of fish was weighted according to degrees of, quote, contamination with polychlorinated biphenyls. When one uses the word contamination, one suggests that this is a toxin or a poison. Isn't that setting out what we exactly are trying to investigate, whether in fact this is a toxin or poison? By using the word contamination, they betray that they're trying to prove a hypothesis from the start to lead in a certain direction results. Neutral language is preferred when looking at a question of a hypothesis. Number 3, there was a sort of declined bias that went on in this study. That originally, when we were looking at this, there were 313 women who agreed to take part in the study. But at the time that they had looked at this, 339 women had eaten the equivalent of at least 11.8 kilograms of Lake Michigan salmon on the original survey. So 313 women allowed their children to be parts of the study and have cord blood drawn, but 339, or in other words 31% of the total number of women who had put down part of the survey, agreed to allow children to participate. What happened with those children who were not part of the study? We'll never know. But there could be a bias built into the fact that the mothers who agreed to participate with their children in the study somehow had a different IQ level of children than women who didn't agree to participate. That sort of confounder issue and bias issue is something the study can't take into account. Number 3 is the issue of a dropout bias. 313 women agreed to allow their children's blood to be measured at birth, but 11 years later, only 212 of those actually still allowed their children to be subjected to an IQ test as part of this study. That's a 32% drop from the original birth participation until age 11. Now, the authors tried to control for that by saying here in the last sentence of the paragraph, the participants who were similar to those lost to follow-up were similar with respect to maternal consumption of Lake Michigan fish, so they ate the same number of fish as the ones who dropped out, the duration of breastfeeding, and postnatal exposure to polychlorinated biphenyls, to PCBs. That is, after the children were born, they didn't get high doses of PCBs relative to those who dropped out. But they were somewhat higher, they admitted, in the prenatal exposure in the womb to PCBs. Their socioeconomic status tended to be higher if they participated in this study, and their maternal age and education also tended to be higher. Well, these are known confounders for IQ, and so to some extent the dropout bias here has a problem that it has known confounders associated with it, and so the study is confounded. These are just background points. We're not talking about meaningful cause right now. We're just critiquing the strengths of this study. The study did try to control for other known confounders for the issue, and I'm not going to read through these here, but this slide is up, and if you're interested in this study, you can pause the slide for a moment and read this to see various different types of confounders in the 212 children that were sampled in the study were tried to be controlled for. One of the interesting things that came up here, though, is although they gave the vision or the pitch that this was going to be a prospective study where they measured the children at birth and tracked the same children until 11 years later and then gave those same children an IQ test, it really wasn't a prospective study if one read carefully in the methodology how this worked. And that's because 70% of the children who were studied in this study did not have PCB blood levels that could be measured at their birth. So what did they do? They either measured the mother's blood levels or serum levels of PCBs and used that as a proxy for the children, or in some cases they simply assigned them a random level at 10% of the distribution as assumptions of how much they would have in their bloodstream. So 70% of the babies actually were given estimates or just guesses about what sort of PCB blood levels there were in their bloodstream as opposed to accurate true measurements. So there's a measurement bias going on here. And think back to when we talked about phenomena and relata in this class. If you don't know the phenomenon, it's awfully hard to know causation. Well, and then beyond that, there's a concern about data snooping or cherry picking to confirm your hypothesis. One always needs to be on the lookout for this. If we're going to test a measure of intelligence and we're going to say we're going to give a battery of different tests, all of which are supposed to reveal whether or not someone's intelligence has declined, then we should make sure that we don't cherry pick if the results are not conclusive. And for a number of different of the tests that they gave, and they gave a battery of tests to these children, the Wechsler Intelligence Scale, which include a full-scale IQ, a verbal IQ, a performance IQ, verbal comprehension, perceptual organization, freedom from distractibility, and so forth. They gave a wide range achievement test with spelling and arithmetic, and they also gave mastery tests with word comprehension, passage comprehension, and reading comprehension. What was interesting was that a number of these tests came back inconclusive, where although the results were negative, they were in fact not statistically significant. Specifically, perceptual organization was not statistically significant at a 95% confidence level, nor was performance IQ, nor was spelling or arithmetic or passage comprehension. All of these were areas where chance could not be ruled out as a result of these studies, that pure randomness was the factor that led to children apparently having lower IQ from mothers that had ingested higher levels of fish, and for which apparently there was higher PCBs in the children's blood, although as we know already, that was an assumption made. So here they've cherry-picked and said, yes, the intelligences were lower, but only by selecting some of the tests as indicative of that and disregarding inconclusive results from other tests. Finally, the study size was actually fairly small in this case, only 211 or 212, I believe, people in the study. And so as a result, when we think back to this, when we were talking about power in an earlier class, one of the points that we wanted to raise is if a study is very small in sample population, we can't tease out large effects because it's a statistically insignificant type of study. There's not enough power in it to generate information about nuanced causal effects. And this was the example given in aspirin, that if we had actually had only 1,700 people in the aspirin study as opposed to 17,000 when we were looking at the relationship between aspirin usage and heart attacks, that we would not have been able to, at any statistically significant level, tease out the fact that aspirin usage reduces the risk of heart attack, albeit slightly. But ultimately, what I wanted to say today, and this is the point about this, leaving aside all of my critiques and banging on the Jacobsons, and I mean them no ill will in doing this, it's simply a nice study to try to critique different aspects of an observational design in a very prestigious medical journal. The point being is that we ask, are these results of the Jacobsons meaningful? Well, here's their conclusion, that the IQ scores of the most highly exposed group of children to PCBs averaged 6.2 points lower than those of the other four groups after adjusting for potential confounding variables that they had listed in that chart I showed you earlier. Well, it's 6 points on an IQ scale. It's almost nothing. It's very, very small differential in terms of the overall amount of IQ loss, if any. And so if we put this into a chart, it looks, if you look at the right end of this chart, that little bar looks much lower than the bars on the other side of it. And this is broken out into quintile of different amounts of PCB exposure for the children below 0.5 all the way up to 1.25 micrograms per gram of fat of PCBs in the fish that they had eaten versus their full-scale IQ score on the vertical axis. It looks like it's so much lower than the others, but if you actually look at the scale, it's only between 4 to 5 points lower in most cases than those other lower exposed PCB children. And so this is not a very large IQ drop, even if we were to accept the validity of the study that there is a causal relationship between a mother's ingestion of PCB and the child's ultimate IQ score. In other words, if changes in the cause do not explain much of the variation in outcomes, they're not meaningful in predicting individual outcomes. Knowing whether a mother has eaten over 11 kilograms of Lake Michigan fish within 5 years before pregnancy does not meaningfully improve our ability to predict the IQ of her child at age 11. It will only, to the extent it predicts anything, predict it to the tune of about 6 points. So the take-home point from last class and from this class on meaningful causation is this. Even if you have established causation to the point of knowledge where something is known to be a risk, we then must ask whether it's a meaningful cause or a meaningful risk. Is this something we need to worry about, to invest resources in, to spend time with? And if it isn't, then why are we spending so much time focusing on it after we've established that it's not a meaningful risk? That's the conclusion for today. I'll look forward to seeing you on the chat boards with your thoughts about what are or aren't meaningful risks for studies that you've looked at.